And we're live.
This is Plant Daddy Podcast, serving you intersectional horticulture. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Steven.
Hello, we are back with another Minisode, focusing on a single specific trending plant that we're really excited about right now. Although, are we still excited about this plant?
Yeah, good catch, Matthew. Yeah. So today we're talking about Pilea peperomioides.
Which I have been calling Pilea peperomioides, and then luckily Jane over at On the Ledge and her guest, Michael Perry, Mr. Plant Geek, helped me learn that I was leaving out a whole syllable. Peperomioides.
So I was avoiding saying that. I was saying Chinese money plant, which I think refers to like 10 other common houseplants.
And I think that a lot of people also just call this the Pilea, even though that is a huge family of plants. But if you hear somebody talking about their Pilea, they mean this one. But yeah, so Stephen, why don't you tell me a little bit about what attracted you to this plant initially?
I think it was this rarity thing. Some friend, maybe it was even you, Matthew, you sent a picture of a storefront in San Francisco with these pileas in the window, and they were $50 each.
This was not me, but I totally believe.
Okay, yeah, someone sent me a picture of that, and I know you had been talking about it already. This was kind of early on in my, plant daddyhood, I would say. And then you offered a cutting, some rabbit casualty in your house, and you're like, oh, this is pretty easy. They're pretty easy to propagate. You could just set this in. I had several carnivorous plants at that point, but this is one of my first sort of non-succulent houseplants, non-carnivorous plants.
Now, it is succulent, but it's not like the kind of succulent that you typically grow.
Yeah, great clarification. Like, but this is one that I'm like, oh, you can just kind of water. This is normal. Put this in quote-unquote normal soil. But for me, I think it was rarity. It's this interesting shape.
Mm-hmm. It has peltate leaves, which are my favorite leaf shape. They are ones where the petiole, which is, people call them stems, but it's the part of the leaf that attaches from the true stem to the back of the leaf. And so these shield-shaped leaves are round, and they just look like coins or pancakes.
Yeah, so I think the look, the rarity. Yeah, how about you, Matthew?
Well, I first saw this plant, like I do many of them, on Pinterest, and it was like the coolest looking thing I'd ever seen. And I think that there were only like maybe 4 or 5 people who were growing it in the States when I came across it. It was probably more than that, but it definitely seemed like this was an extreme rarity. And so I did some research on it, and I learned some really fascinating things about kind of its origin. Do you want to hear about that now, or do you want to save it?
I do want to hear about it, Matthew, but I'll preface this by saying our listeners have probably heard about it. Our listeners could have heard about it even more. I feel like in maybe 25% of episodes, I edit out some version of Matthew telling the story about seeing it in the Netherlands, seeing it on Pinterest and ordering it. Okay, so I
like to reuse my stories.
No, you love that one. You live it every time you're in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have loved this plant for a while, or you did love it then, and okay, we'll get into that.
Let's see if Steven leaves this in or if he edits it out.
We'll see.
So this was probably at least like 5 years ago. And when I first encountered this plant online, I was just obsessed with having to find it. And I couldn't in any of the local plant shops. I couldn't find it in any of the United States nurseries or garden centers that I often order from to have plants shipped to me. So I went and I turned to eBay, which is my trusted source for anything that you can't buy, conveniently. And I had to buy it from somebody in the Netherlands because this isn't a plant that was grown in the United States 5 years ago. And the cuttings that were being sold were like stupid expensive, and they were real small.
Like how much?
Like the starting bid would be like $45, and it would be like a 3-leafed offshoot, and like the shipping then would be $20. Like it was just cost prohibitive, and it's a cool plant, but it's not that cool. So I found a seller in the Netherlands who shipped a baby plant to me that was still quite small, but I think that with shipping, I paid like $25 total for the plant. I potted it up, and I was so excited about it. It didn't have any roots, so
Wow.
yeah, like
Non-rooted cutting
yeah.
across the ocean. Okay.
It survived though, and it made it to my home. So I put it in a pot of coarse, gritty soil, and I covered the top of it just with like a glass so that it would hold some humidity in while it was forming
Wow.
roots.
It's treated so
I
preciously.
was
Okay.
so anxious about this
Yeah.
plant. Like, I was the only person I knew who had one, and I was, as far as I could tell, the only person in America with one. And so it was just this really fun process of watching it grow new leaves, each new leaf becoming larger. And then it was really easy to see that it was rooting because the roots, in addition to growing down into the soil, were also kind of like creeping along the top of it so I could watch the progress. And then I just kind of slowly let the plant acclimate to standard room humidity. And when I took the glass off of it, it was like fully happy and it just started growing out new leaves. Now, it very quickly began to grow little baby plants. Each little shoot that would come up around the base might be like right next to the plant or it might grow out a few inches, but those are
Hmm.
really easy to just kind of sever off and pot up individually. Even if they had no roots, they would root really reliably, and I don't think that I lost a single plant when I was propagating this. So,
Sounds right to me. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, propagation is so easy. That's great. Honestly, it's so
yeah.
nice about this plant.
Basically, as soon as I had it, I was dumbstruck that they were regularly selling for at least $45 when they did eventually start becoming available in the United States. Because I have said this in another episode, I don't think anybody should pay for these. I think that everybody
Yeah.
should just pass one along to their friends, which is actually why across the Atlantic in Europe, they're called pass it along plants or friendship plants
Okay.
because the way that they have been disseminated into like every household in Europe is because somebody just like snaps a piece off and gives it to their friend.
So would you say this was like 5 years ago?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
By now, I have given them to so many people, and I have several potted ones in my apartment that are
Hmm.
variably attractive. I have been experimenting with their cultural conditions a bit, and I have to say, Stephen, the plant that I gave you originally is the most beautiful one that has come out of this original plant that I ordered from the Netherlands.
Oh, why, thank you. Fan self.
Yeah, like it's nicer than mine, and I kind of hate you just a
We were
small
talking, yeah,
amount.
we were talking about that before. I think, Matthew just uses his window space totally differently. I
I
gave
pack the
mine.
plants in there.
Yeah, I don't have a ton in this one window because I'm growing so much stuff under grow lights and trying to control conditions in a different way. So I think it has such good real estate. It has a big pot. I actually picked up some great soil at a local nursery too. So it's kind of had a bunch of lucky good conditions.
Well, tell me
And
about the soil that you're using.
so what I did is I used some kind of airy soil, just a house plant soil that I got at Indoor Sun Shop here in Seattle. That's one that we probably mention almost every episode. But also I picked up some vegetable soil from a place called Keep It Simple Nursery in Woodinville. It's an organic, really kind of like a vegetable garden focused little nursery. And it was really dense soil. I had to kind of cut it, but I put it in there thinking like, oh, this plant likes to remain wet. It seems like it's pretty easy in
Yeah.
various conditions. So I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna try it out in this pot because I had so much of it. I had to buy a bunch of it.
The soil that I used was probably a little grittier than yours. I was using like a true succulent mix.
Oh wow. Okay.
Probably also from the Indoor Sun Shop because I really like the coarse mineral pumiciness of theirs. So if I was going to make a recommendation for the soil, I think that it doesn't need to be that gritty. I think that they are a plant that survives pretty well in most any soil condition. But what I've discovered from the plants that I've been growing, like their succulents, that can cause the leaves to kind of dimple. And
Okay. You
so
see this a lot.
yeah, and this is a problem that I've had some people reach out on our Instagram to ask about.
Uh huh.
And I think that the reason that they get puckered and dimpled is that they don't have enough water, they're drying too much, they're drying too much, they're drying too quickly, they're not having enough moisture.
Huh.
They are a plant that can tolerate some dryness, of course, but I think that the best approach is probably what you're doing to pot it in a fairly large pot because they'll become quite large plants if you let them. and then just keep it fairly evenly moist. You'll probably
Yeah.
taper that off for the winter when they're not as active in growth, but they seem to be a plant that likes warmth, that likes heat, and can tolerate anything from fairly low light, not as low as you'd go with a snake plant or Dracaena or something,
Hmm.
but I think that they burn in bright light. I've never had a problem with them in an east facing window, but I
Yeah.
think that you'd probably want to protect them in a south facing window.
So I've seen some people just let these grow, kind of spill out of the pot. Some people stake these up. I was first staking mine, really wanting it to kind of grow into this tree looking awesome, yeah, kind of in my mind like a Dr. Seuss tree almost.
Well, and the first ones that I saw on social media were being grown that way,
Yeah.
and they were mostly being grown in. It's a type of terracotta pot that we call rose pots, where they're kind of tall and tapered, but there's a small surface area on the top for a deep rooted plant. And so I loved
Hmm.
the look of them staked up, growing with like maybe a couple of loose free babies around the bottom, but with the main plant basically being like a Dr. Seuss tree. I have since then, now that a lot more people are growing them, seen many more ways that people have done it. And I think that my
Yeah.
favorite way is like you've done, where you just kind of let it grow up until it finally succumbs to its own weight, and then it starts to kind of drape and be a little bit pendant, and it just spills over the edges of the pot and fills it really
Yeah,
nicely.
and I agree with you now, but I'll admit I was propping it up. It just, the support fell. And it's a brittle plant. I think a lot of people probably know this. It just broke off.
The leaves also break off from the stem easily. The stem breaks off from
Yeah.
itself easily.
So this was like my plan B where I just give up and, let it spill and do its thing. And I'm really happy with it.
The great thing about them is that they have like just this fantastic ability to resprout new foliage from broken off stems and also to grow roots from the broken off portion. So if you do bust your plant up on accident or your cat knocks it over or something or your rabbit chews a portion of it off,
Yeah.
it's not lost. You actually now have multiple plants to work with.
Yeah. You have more plants than maybe you want,
Yeah.
honestly.
And in fact, that's why you pass it on because you have so
Yeah.
many of them. But the weird thing about this plant to me is that it is so like precious and like people are still really in love with it and it's still such a
That's
commodity.
That's the confusing thing to me too. And just
Yeah.
to be clear, we're in, Seattle in the United States. It arrived here a couple of years ago, but it's kind of at the tail end of maybe some trendiness, right? So
Well,
some
yeah.
places I see it for $4. Some places they're still charging $25.
Yeah, we were kind of joking about it a few years ago after I began sharing it, and I had enough vegetative material that I was propagating it readily that my plan was going to be to just like propagate the hell out of this plant and then just start like selling it myself when I could retire early. And I totally missed the boat on that because soon Walmart was carrying them for $15. And once Walmart's doing that, I suddenly lose most of my interest in something that was once a very rare commodity. But the interesting thing is that after I had this plant for a while, I was actually in the Netherlands and just wandering around the city and like looking at, people's gardens in Amsterdam. Everyone had one of these. They were absolutely everywhere. And what was really fascinating is that they are so ubiquitous in Europe. But do you know how they entered cultivation?
I have heard the story, but tell our listeners.
Well, so in the 1940s, there was a Norwegian missionary. His name was Agnar Espegren. I'm so sorry if you speak Norwegian. I probably didn't get that right. But he was a missionary in China. And I guess that, he had to flee because of communism and political strife, blah, blah, blah. But his wife brought cuttings of this plant back because they were in a region where it grew wild and people in China would often just grow them because they were so easy to cultivate and they're so ornamental. So his wife brought some back to Scandinavia when they returned and just began sharing it with people. And so from 1946, when it entered the European, houseplant market, it wasn't being commercially propagated. It's a plant that spread to like nearly every home just because people were passing them along to their friends when they had babies to propagate. So it has this really fascinating and like great social background, But the plant wasn't even described in science until several decades later, when people started kind of asking for more information about it, and there sort of wasn't any information. So I believe it was the 1980s when it was first actually described and placed properly into taxonomy. And the plants themselves are still like tremendously popular, but there's so little known about them when you compare them with like all these other houseplants that have been equally popular over the period.
So this is one that almost never flowers, right? Or
As
what's
far
the
as
story there?
well, as far as I know, it does indeed flower, but the flowers are nothing special. They kind of come out on these like branching inflorescences. They might be kind of like reddish orange, but I could be wrong. So if you have more information about this, please let us know so that I can be more correct in the future. But I think that the original plants that were brought back, it's the same one. So like almost everyone is growing the exact same plant. It's just clones. And so they're not self-fertile. So I don't think that anybody has actually grown like a seed-grown Pilea peperomioides.
Good
In
catch.
peperomioides.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I have seen some photos of them blooming, but it definitely seems like this is a plant that you are going to grow from cuttings instead of flowers. Also, I would not grow this plant for its flowers because they are not unique or special enough to compete with the foliage.
Yeah, you can Google it. It almost doesn't look like a flower to me. I mean, okay, it is, whatever.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also one of those plants that it has male flowers at one time and it has female flowers at another time, but they're not going to be at the same moment, so it would be difficult to cross pollinate the same one. Anyway,
So sometimes we see people on social media mentioning some challenges they have. We touched on a couple points about this plant, maybe the brittleness, light needs.
dimpled leaves.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, I think that this is a plant that maybe people overthink because honestly, it's as easy as putting it in a soil that is not soggy and not bone dry. It's giving it bright indirect light. They're not picky about humidity. They like to dry slightly, but they're pretty forgiving with their water schedule.
Yeah.
I think that people think that these are way more special and precious than they really are. I feel like this is a true houseplant weed. And so if you're having trouble with this plant, I honestly think that what you need to do is just be a little bit more negligent with it.
Yeah, or maybe just the ways that you would address most plants, be like, okay, well, move it into higher light maybe.
Yeah.
Or yeah, let it dry out more.
Yeah, problems that you might encounter if you keep it too wet, it can definitely rot. And I did, in fact, rot one of the plants that I was propagating because I tried growing it in a plastic pot inside of a larger cache pot. And that meant that I wasn't really able to monitor the amount of moisture that it had. And I was kind of
Yeah.
trying, after seeing what Steven's looked like and how beautiful his is, I thought, well, let's just see if I keep a plant wet, like, will that help it grow? It didn't. It rotted off, and like I lost that plant. I took the top for cuttings, but like that was the one time that I've actually killed one of these. I've also had some of them that have shed a lot of leaves because they've either had mealy bugs or I've let them get too dry.
Yeah, I was going to say that looked like dryness to me when I've seen that in yours.
Yeah, and I tend to keep these a little bit more dry than they want. But I think that overall, if you just treat it like any other basic, simple house plant, I think you should have pretty solid luck with them. Just don't
Yeah.
overthink it.
So I have seen some yellow spotting in leaves in mine. I took that to be a fertilization issue. Like that usually happened after periods of a lot of growth.
It also seems like the yellow spotting are like centered around the stomata on the leaves. So I don't really
Okay.
know what that might mean, but it seems like the respiration holes in the leaf are what yellows. So I think that overall, this is a pretty easy, pretty dependable plant.
Yeah.
And it should grow pretty much like a weed for you as long as you just give it some really basic minimal care.
Yeah, and the good news, if you've had trouble, you can probably try again from some friend's plant.
Yeah, like actually, if you're having trouble, get in touch with us because Steven or I will send you cuttings if you pay the postage. So, like, I want everybody to be successful with this plant, and it is indeed easy enough that I think that anybody can be successful with it.
All right, so I would say we are several years into this Pilea phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it,
They're now
right?
everywhere.
They're everywhere. Maybe the bubble has burst. Maybe we're post Pilea peperomioides fever. What are
Yeah.
some alternatives, Matthew?
So I think that on one hand, we might be past it, but look at what they're doing with them in Europe. They're everywhere. They're just like jade plants or angel wing begonias. Like they're a mainstay in European homes. So I think that it's going to do that here. But I heard Jane Perrone on the Ledge and a few of her guests talking about this plant because they're kind of amazed that it's still so popular and that people are paying such high prices. I think it was more available here than it was in the UK even,
Oh, wow.
which is
Okay.
bizarre given their proximity to Scandinavia.
Yeah.
But they had a few plants that they were mentioning as being like more handsome, more interesting, cooler, more covetable plants with round leaves. I was kind of thinking about what James said because honestly, like I said, peltate shaped leaves are my favorite. I love them on nasturtiums and Stephania and lotus, and the Pilea peperomioides is one that has that. But then I kind of thought about it, and there's a few other really neat ones. These are all going to be like fairly related. I'm sure that you've heard of the watermelon peperomia. This is Peperomia argyrii or argyria.
Okay. So watermelon pepperoni. Wait,
Yeah, the
so
watermelon peperomia.
that's what's called watermelon pepperomia, not watermelon pilea?
No, so
Oh,
here is a
okay. I
really
got
quick
this.
taxonomy lesson. Pilea is its own genus. Peperomia is its own genus.
Yeah.
And Pilea peperomioides, that name means the pilea that looks like a peperomia.
Okay.
So
Great.
that's kind of part of its history. But the peperomia watermelon has also round to kind of like obtusely teardrop shaped leaves that are peltate. And they have really beautiful pale silvery green stripes.
It's very watermelon looking.
Yeah, it's like a watermelon, and they're really pretty. Another pilea Another peperomia that is really interesting that I think that people want to talk about is the species Polybotyra, and this has basically the same look as a Pilea peperomioides, except that it has a little point like an obtuse teardrop. The leaves are very much the same, where the petiole attaches on the back. There's a little bit of a light dot on the surface of the leaf, but it's otherwise evenly green. The structure of the plant behind the leaves is a little different. The pileo will grow like one stem with lots of petioles branching out of it, all ending in a leaf. But the peperomia grows a little bit different, where it's more of like a rhizome that has leaves coming out of it. It's also really beautiful, and I think that I've started to see this one coming out as like the new alternative. Like people want something that's not the pilea, but they still want the pilea. But the one that I actually want to pick up that's kind of the same idea with round peltate leaves is a begonia that I've only seen once in real life for sale. And Stephen, where did we see that plant?
It was at Peace, Love, and Happiness, a store in Fremont and Seattle.
That's right. Yeah. So this was a really beautiful begonia that I almost and probably should have bought when we were there. But it is Begonia conchifolia. And it's not as round as the pilea. It's a little bit less teardrop shaped than the other two that I mentioned. But it has a bright red spot on the surface of the leaf where the petiole attaches. The stems themselves and the petioles, they're a little bit more reddish, so you get slightly more color on a similar plant. And
Yeah.
because this is it's a rhizomaceous begonia, it's going to stay fairly small compared to the massive size that you'll get from your Pilea
Yeah,
peperomioides.
and it's really an interesting look. I think it's truly a begonia version of, the money plant.
Yeah, it's a Costa Rican plant that was discovered in the 50s, and I don't really know what its cultural requirements are. This is probably the trickiest of the plants that we just mentioned as alternatives, just because it's a begonia. And
Yeah.
I think that if you want to find something else, I think that the watermelon peperomia, the peperomia polybotyra, and
That begonia.
yeah, and that begonia, those are your best chances. But the two peperomias are going to be like the sweet spot of an easy house plant that gives you that look without being this one.
So, Matthew, is this plant here to stay? I mean, yes, I would say. If
Yeah,
we tried to eradicate it now, it'd probably be difficult.
I think that it is
It's
now so
everywhere.
rooted into our homes and people's
Yeah.
minds. I think that yes, it is here to stay. Like I said before, it's still popular in Europe.
Yeah.
It's a plant that you're seeing for really cheap amounts now compared with 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
I think that that makes it much more valuable because it is stupid to spend that much money on a plant that you can grow so easily, and you can propagate them in greenhouses for distribution so easily. So there's no reason to charge that much.
Yeah, and I hate to say this, and I know sometimes for people who are, sometimes people just can't grow certain plants, right? They just don't perform for them. This one I think is so easy for so many people
Yeah.
that it's a great gift. It's great for getting someone into plants. I mean, things like that.
And that is no shade if this happens to be the plant that you can't grow.
Yeah, we all have plants like
I
that.
personally can't grow Syngonium very well, which is one of the easiest dependable houseplants. So, you can laugh at me while we're, gently encouraging you to try it again. But what I think we're going to see with this plant is that while it's very popular right now, I think that it's going to become less popular, and we're going to just start thinking of it the same way that we do like Jade Plant or Sansevieria, one of
Yeah.
those classics that tried and true, anybody can do it. They're going to lose their specialness, and I think that a lot
Yeah.
of the reason that they're popular right now is because we have a hangover from how rare they were 5 years ago, and so everyone still wants this. So there are so many plants entering the plant market that as soon as they get picked up by social media, there's an explosion of demand for them. Like one of our recent plant profiles on Begonia maculata, this is another one of them. There are so many plants that people just want and they'll pay anything for. Doesn't have anything to do with how easy they are or how
Yeah.
challenging they are or even how rare or special they are in any way. It's just that when they first entered the plant market, the demand hasn't been able to be met by the supply.
Yeah, I think this bubble, it may have burst already, right? But I do think there's going to be a wave of like people who are just sick of this plant. Like it's kind of a cliche plant, or it's kind of, over, so to speak.
I wonder how we'll think about it in 40 years. The way that we look at a lot of plants like African violets as being like grandma plants. I
Yeah.
wonder what this one will be reputed as.
This is going to be something that millennials look back on as like their first plant that they really wanted, and or
Well,
something like that.
kind of the way that like people think of like spider plants in the 70s. Like I think that this is going to fall into that category. Which is nice because that means that they'll still be grown and there will be a point in the future where they're seen as like a cool vintage throwback, the way that like the Monstera deliciosa
Yeah,
is like
maybe.
a 1950s statement plant and the White Bird of Paradise is a 1970s statement plant. This will be the early thousands statement plant.
Yeah. Um, I'll just share one story. This is the only one. This is the only plant that I've seen that has had its own standalone stall at a fair. Um, this was
Yeah.
a year or two ago. I went to I won't name the fair or the shop. I don't want to call anyone out. But it was I mean I'm sure it's gone now. A business that was just selling these plants. They were selling them for $45 each. I went up, and at that point, I had gotten mine maybe a couple months ago from Matthew. I went up and asked, I was like, oh, so yeah, can you tell me about these? I was just curious what they were going to say, right? And she's
Yeah.
like, okay, so it's this money plant. Every single one is unique in how it grows.
That's true of
You
all
can see
plants.
that. Yeah, just stuff like that. That was pure kind of
Yeah.
hype. But I think when I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, like what is this going to be? And at this, anyway, so we've seen what it's going to be now, and I think it's probably done.
Many times when I give one of these to a friend or a colleague or something, I will give it to them with a special little like, according to Chinese legend, it is both good luck to give and receive this plant. I think I read that on the internet somewhere, but they could have made it up or I could have made it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but it's a beautiful sentiment.
Isn't that?
Yeah. Now, we talked about how easy it is to find them, but ultimately, do we enjoy growing them?
I do. Like, I don't grow this thinking that this is the most special plant in my collection or anything, but I think it's been easy for me. It's flopping over and, creating ever larger leaves, and it's just kind of interesting one.
And don't hate me for saying this, but it's one of the most like aesthetically attractive plants that you have.
Wow, Matthew.
You have a lot of amazing plants,
Okay.
but it's gorgeous.
Yeah, I'm processing that and I'm trying to keep rolling here.
Guys, this might be our
I
last
would not,
episode.
yeah, I would not agree with that. But okay, the one that I have, I really like how it turned out, so I'll
Yeah.
agree on that.
I think I just have peperomioides envy that I'm not doing whatever Steven's doing with mine. I love mine, they're beautiful, but Steven's is like a masterpiece. I enjoy growing them because I love the story of how they came into cultivation in people's homes and how science didn't even know about them until, like, for 4 decades, people had gotten them all over Scandinavia. Like, I just think that's a beautiful story,
Yeah,
and I
that's
would grow them
interesting.
just for that alone.
Yeah, and even their recent story, coming here, that was interesting too.
Yeah.
How coveted they were and how expensive.
This was definitely my first experience of watching a plant, like, become popular on social media and then create a demand that couldn't be filled. Like, it was really fascinating to watch. I find this plant amazing just for, like, the social geographic story that it has.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add about this plant?
No.
So, as usual, you can find us on all of the social medias at Plant Daddy Podcast. And you can also email us at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com. Let us know if there are other plants or types of plants that you want to hear us discuss in future minisodes, because we are going to be putting a lot of these out to cover all of the various plant needs that you want to learn about. So, until next time, this has been Plant Daddy Podcast. Happy growing.
All right, and get in touch if you want those cuttings. Seriously.
Yeah, pay the postage and we'll literally mail you them.
Happy growing.
I said that. You need to say bye.
Bye.